There we go. Does it? I am on. Hey, good morning. It's a pretty good turnout considering we're competing against Kathy Pearl. But that's okay. My name is Karen Kashansky, and I'm a conversation design lead at Google. I was here last year presenting on how we designed and shipped Google Assistant on the Pixel Watch. Since then, my role has changed, and I've been working on Gemini because it is the thing to work on. And even within the year, was able to launch the Gemini mobile app for iOS and Android. So how we might talk to our LLMs in our mobile app, and what are those kinds of experiences we want to create, talking directly to the LLM. Within my years of experience, I've had the privilege of shipping many products into production. And so when I saw the title of the panel today, what's actually worked for you in production, what I immediately thought of was, what's all the shit you have to get done, to get to production, to make it work in production. So we're going to touch on that a little today as well. I'll have our panelists introduce themselves with a little background, and just to be able to explain, like, what is production for you? Like, where are you shipping, or how are you shipping products? Like, what does production look like?
I can get started. This is working, I think. I'm Dennis. I lead the machine learning team at Voiceflow, which is a conversational AI platform and cafe server as well. So I've been at Voiceflow for the past 3 years. I joined as the first machine learning engineer, where the problem for me was, let's figure out how to bring machine learning in-house. Go do it. So prior to that, I worked at a large Canadian bank. So for me, going to production is whatever is going to production for our customers. So we have 60 enterprise customers, hundreds of thousands of other users using the platform. So as long as they're happy, I'm happy. If they're not happy, I'm usually up at night. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sebastian. I run product marketing for Cognigy, and Cognigy is a conversational AI software maker from Germany. We work with over 1,000 brands globally. And as a product marketer, I am kind of in between the development and the engineers, the technology, the research, the R&D part, and also our customers, right? So I oversee customer advocacy, and I get to hear all the stories. Many of them positive, but of course there are learnings. The definition of production is, it gets real, right? There's end customers talking to our bots, to our products, and that is when it's time to shine.
I'm John. I'm at Quick. I'm a conversational architect there. So I told a lot of you yesterday, the way I introduce that is I talk to LLMs all day, but I get to build the experiences that our customers use. And so for production for us is we have new customers who are using fully generative AI assistants, all the way down to customers that we've had for years that now we're folding in LLM experiences, either revamping an NLU bot or a decision tree bot, all the way through adding in maybe product search via LLM on part of those assistants. So we've got a kind of a wide range of what production means in relation to LLMs.
Great. So if we start for like the before it gets to production, what would you say is like the most important thing to focus on or to get right? If there are, one or two top things where you focus your time to get to success, to get to a successful, production launch.
I mean, I think the thing to really take into account is, what is the actual goal? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the KPIs that you're going to use to measure that, and defining those early? Because otherwise you get scope creep, or you get to the end and it's not built in a way that you can measure that KPI. So you can't prove whether it worked or not. So I think defining the scope of the project up front is critical.
Yeah, 100% agree. Defining a clear outcome and a goal, that is absolutely mission critical for getting it right. And the other aspect, in my eyes, is assembling the right team, especially on the client side. Projects that have gone into the wrong direction mostly went in the wrong direction because they were solely led by technologists or by conversation designers, right? But after all, A recipe for success is building a cross-functional team that has great buy-in within the organization, that can take the ownership of all different aspects. And we've just heard the legal implications, right, of getting a bot live. You want to catch that early, and the best way to catch that is through a cross-functional team with kind of the dedicated management responsibility to do the right things.
100% agree. Conversational design, launching conversational AI experiences is a team sport, so you have to get that right. I think for me, it's defining, sort of going back to those KPIs and success criteria is, are you launching for good enough, or are you launching for excellence? So there's sort of two competing trains of thought in terms of product development. Do you build an MVP and you're embarrassed by your launch? Or do you develop something that's so polished that you're proud of and you just blow the competition out of the water? So I think for these kinds of experiences, you have to make that decision of how you're going to build, because it's going to affect so many things. How polished is your copyright? How polished is your UI? How good do your models have to be? How flashy is your demo? Like all these different things, like who you're launching to. Are you going up on stage with your biggest customer and doing this big keynote, versus are you launching to 10 community members to see how they break it? So determining that process and how you're going to launch a feature, because it might be different for every feature, every experience. I think just being aware of that and being aligned as a team is really, really important.
So customers come to you and they want to design, they want to deploy, some kind of experience. What's the biggest misunderstanding that customers have in that process of like figuring out what to build? What do you need to teach them before you can get to something that you're proud of?
Yeah, well, let me take a start. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings with non-technical people is still that AI is a magic machine. I can give it all my documents and then it's going to do my job, right? And that's just not true, right? We try to make it as easy as possible, and you guys do, right? But it is hard work. So there's a lot of human thinking involved before getting the experiences right, and managing those expectations with the right team, in all the directions within an organization. That is probably, that's one of the most critical things in the start.
Yeah, very similar. One thing that I think we combat a lot in the beginning is people are scared of LLMs, right? You see the stories about hallucinations, or the bots that somebody showed up on the screen yesterday that have sold a Chevy for $1, that kind of thing, right? And so people are scared of them. So you spend all this time convincing them that you can build it safely, and then you do all the work, and then at the end, they don't know why it doesn't work 100% perfectly every time. So you fight this battle of they are both unsafe and not perfect. And somewhere in the middle is where it should be, but you can't, it's very hard to convince people once they're scared of it that it doesn't then need to be perfect. So what I try to talk to customers about is, you put human agents in front of people all day, every day, and they're not perfect, right? They make mistakes, they drop the wrong link in, they say something incorrect, and that's okay. And you work on it, right? You train them, you teach them, you improve that process. And so I think it's the same thing with AI assistants. It's not perfect. You're going to train it, you're going to work on it, you're going to improve it.
I think going beyond the initial launch and education component is getting out of what I call POC purgatory. So somebody goes and they build a project. They're like, oh, I can chat with my data. Here's a PDF uploader. Let me ask it questions. And then you go into a production application and they're like, okay, how do I connect this to my database? And it's like, what database? Where is the scope? Like, how do you do that, right? So being able to go through and gather those requirements and understand what integrations do you need to do? How do you handle fallbacks? All these conversational design principles that we've been working through for the past 5, 10, 20 years, and integrating it into that generative AI experience that exists. Because getting to that POC, pretty easy. It's flashy. There's a billion demos on it. Getting it into production, right? The whole topic of the panel, that takes a lot more work, and it needs more thought as well.
What I would like to comment on that, because what I'm also seeing is that many people have the expectations that LLM are going to replace everything we have, right? Now it's Gen AI that's doing the whole job, but we don't think that is actually true. There's many conversational experiences that are perfectly well set up in a deterministic way, right? If I want to, let's say, change my address, there's 3 steps I need to do, right? And a human agent would also follow the script. So why do I need to use an LLM to do that, right? So building a hybrid world that really brings best of both together is also something that sometimes needs to be managed in customer expectations.
So during this process of, designing, building, like what are the key indicators from that phase that your production will be a success? Like what are the things that you look for specifically to be like, yep, like we're on track?
I'll get started. So I think it's iteration speed of the team that's building. I think there's a lot of companies and teams out there who just want to pay somebody for something and forget about it. And that can be a very dangerous game to play because you no longer know what's happening with your own experience. You don't own it. You don't understand how to work on it. And teams that we worked with that had the most success, they're in there and they're testing things every day. They're editing it. They're optimizing. They're experimenting. They understand their experience really, really well. It's not outsourced. It's a key component. It's a key product in their ecosystem. So that iteration time where you're working with somebody and they're bugging you every day, every hour, you're like, yes, okay, they get it. They want this. They want to succeed, not, oh, can we set up a meeting in 3 weeks to talk about this? It's like, good luck. Good luck.
Yeah, I think that, and then for having access to the data. So did they buy something and they're not ready to give you access to data, or is there a hiccup in the way that you're going to connect to the API? And that builds the whole experience, right? Like that experience needs to be built on top of data. And so without that data, you can't build to the kind of what they're looking for. So that plus this idea of knowing what you want and not having, I think I'm definitely going to take the POC purgatory term back home. But this,
we all are.
Yeah. this idea that you started this large scope in a demo and you need to pick the use case that you're solving for and have the data, have the things that you need to build it, and then start to iterate on top of that.
I agree. And for me, a strong success indicator is a team that goes really narrow but very deep into one use case. Doing one thing really well in the beginning is a great success criteria because it allows you to demonstrate success internally to your organization. And from a financial standpoint, making a successful first use case allows you to pay for iteration 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because too many people, they just stop at some point because they figure, well, it's not as broad, it's not as good, as I want it to be. But getting one thing right, that can be a transformative experience for the whole organization.
Well, I will say, being at Google, we don't always get it right when we launch to production, but we're not going to talk about that. But personally, I have seen there is nothing like getting real data from real users, as much as Michal was just saying about, testing with people. Like sometimes you can do that externally. Sometimes like we're just going to use internal people, and it's never the same. It's never the same with the diversity and the different contexts and like how people actually use something. So like finally launching is such an important point. But then it's day one. Like then what happens, right? It's like, how do you get the data and how do you learn from that really quickly? So I'd love to hear something that you learned unexpectedly, as something went into, after something was launched.
So one story I like to tell is that we were building out our NLU system in-house for intent classification and entity extraction. This was a few years ago. We started the project. And what was interesting was our users, the way they think about semantic similarity and similar concepts is different than somebody who's building in the industry. So as an example, we launched it and we have a few intents and a customer is like, it's matching to the wrong intents. And we're like, what do you mean? They're like, well, I've defined 3 intents. One is my store open, book a dental appointment, and a none intent. And somebody's asking to book a doctor's appointment, not a dentist's appointment. And we're like, okay, well, doctors are pretty similar to dentists. They're like, no, they're very different. We're like, okay, well, to a general model, when you say I want to go to a dentist and a doctor, if you do a similarity score between those two, they're very, very similar. So even that education component of when you're so in the product development phase, you're building for one user persona, let's say somebody who understands intent classification, semantic similarity, and somebody comes in and says, as a human, those two concepts are similar, but you don't want a doctor, you don't want a neurosurgeon working on your teeth, right? So that kind of process was pretty interesting, and figuring out afterwards, how do you go back and fill in those education components, those documents, those examples, those YouTube videos to help go through that process.
Yeah, one learning that I can share, as a software maker, we don't only look at what our end customers are doing with the bots, but also what our clients are building with our software together with their partners. And I think one thing that we in the last year found more obvious is around RAG, and so we call it knowledge AI, right? And that works perfectly fine with a defined set of documents, but we have some clients who tried uploading suddenly 10,000 PDFs, right? And technically it works, but it didn't give good answers. And I think that's easy to understand, because if you look at the human equivalent of hiring someone in your contact center and giving them 10,000 PDFs, how would they ever find a good answer, right? Even if they could read in lightning speed. So together with our clients, we worked on structuring that, on understanding how do we need to kind of cluster these documents so that even an AI can make sense of them, right? What do we have to do on top of that? And that is definitely something that we learned when our clients scaled the experiences from a prototype or from a niche use case to something that is much, much broader.
Well, same kind of idea, where I feel like customers have all this old data and it's been fine forever, and then they put it in and they want to use it, and now all of a sudden, like, why did it answer that way? That article is from 7 years ago, and they didn't know until people were asking and using it. But also that nature of, we launched and now it's been launched for like 7 minutes and I already have 15 changes I want to make to it, and like. It's just like everything is really sped up in this LLM world, right? Where now it has to be, like, we're scared of it. It has to be perfect. It launched, got to fix it right now. And so I don't know that any of that is super unexpected, but it's been very real. And when we're launching, and so the ability to have tests that we can fall back on has been critical, right? So somebody says, oh, it's answering this way and it shouldn't. And so you go in and you want to make a routing change or a prompt change or whatever. If you don't have the test set to fall back on and say, okay, we ran 30 tests and everything that we built previously works, so we feel confident deploying this change, that's really useful. So you can make that change. When they ask for it at 7 minutes, you can make it at 8 minutes, So that ability to fall back on, we feel confident because X, Y, and Z are already taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of feeling confident, and you talked also, John, about KPIs, like, what are some of the metrics that you ensure you can access quickly, or like the success metrics that you talk about with your, customers?
The question that I get asked all the time is, and this isn't necessarily an answer exactly, because they ask, what's the containment rate? And I'll follow up, is it good containment or bad containment or whatever that is? But I find that there are KPIs that work across customers, but really they're pretty use case specific. So are we answering from this type of document often enough, or are we moving to agent, at whatever percent? And it feels different for every customer. One thing that it's not necessarily a metric, but we've had a lot of customers ask, how are we going to identify the knowledge gaps? So people start using it. We've all tested internally at Quick. The customers tested internally, but now real users are using it, right? And so where are those knowledge gaps? So building in a way where it's easy to show. Right. Here's all the conversations that we couldn't answer. So look at those transcripts. We can use those transcripts and do an analysis and start to identify those knowledge gaps. So maybe not a KPI exactly, but something that comes up, I would say, with every customer.
Yeah, we mostly deploy into contact centers, and contact centers are traditionally very, very strong at numbers, right? They know everything. And that is why it's easy to measure the impact of a before and after bringing in the conversational AI experience. So the traditional metrics that we look at is, successful transactions, right? First contact resolution, average hold time. In the case of Agent Assist, we also look at the time agents need between calls. For example, for call summarization, that is something where we can carve out 30 or 60 seconds easily. So these contact center metrics are definitely most important, at least for our enterprise clients, because that is what everything is about.
I think going back to the point of conversation AI is a team sport and it's use case specific. We recently did a talk with our support lead, and we went through 15 different metrics for customer support. and we went into the details. We talked about the philosophy of what are the first metrics you need to do as a crawl milestone, what's a walk milestone as a second stage of metrics, and what's a run milestone. And you can do that for every single kind of AI use case where you dive into specific details, and then you figure out who owns that metric or that KPI. So for example, if you're looking at automation rate or containment rate, sort of a top level metric, everybody might own that metric as a team, as a product, as a company. Then you get into details, things like latency. That might be the dev team that owns it. It might be the number of frustrated customers. That might be split across the copywriting team or development team or support team. It really depends. But as an organization, you know your product, you know your team, you know your customers best. So our goal is to work with a team and say, what's important to you? Have you thought about these teams or these metrics, and who on your team is going to own and iterate on it? Because if nobody owns it, then it's not going to get done.
Before we take questions from the audience, anything any of you want to bring up that we haven't touched on, or a question that you want to ask the other panelists? We touched on right. Especially, we wanted to touch on the team. The team is so important, right? How do you build? I guess one thing, like, how do you build a team to support this was one thing. But is there anything else? Not well. So okay. Should we open up? We have about 5 minutes left. I think we'll open for questions.
Thank you. My question's about something that you mentioned earlier, Sebastian, in terms of the implementations that didn't go so well were because they were purely led by technologists. So flipping it to the positive, the ones that did go well, what was the setup there? What kind of roles were involved and what kind of process was followed?
The setup in the most successful projects was just cross-functional as possible. So there were linguists involved, there were customer service professionals involved, there were technology people involved, even legal and marketing people, right? So the only piece of advice is make it as cross-functional as you can get it, and that seems to be a driver for success.
Thank you. And I'm interested if the other two of you have any views on that in terms of team setup.
Really getting whoever those stakeholders are, getting them to agree on the KPIs ahead of time, so that you don't launch and then all of a sudden this thing that you wanted to measure, you didn't build in a way that you can measure. So even if it's not necessarily the thing that's going to drive the experience, if you know you want to measure it, build it ahead of time so that in 3 weeks or 3 months, you can give a number for what's happening.
I would say that the team that's previously owned a certain experience, I think they should continue to work on it, and hopefully the largest capacity, like within our own internal automation for support, the support team owns it. They have the most context, they know what they're building, they can iterate quickly, and they can make those decisions of ROI. Am I going to put in 1 hour of work to improve our AI agent, or am I going to put 1 hour of work to answer support tickets, right? And often we get these organizational structures where a team will come in and parachute in and try to fix stuff, right? And that can create problems for a number of reasons, because you lose so much institutional knowledge. You create chaos when people are fighting for who owns what domain. So keep people involved who've been working on it. It's really important.
Thank you very much.
Hi. So we were talking about security a lot today, and usually when you go to production, your last go-no-go call is made by privacy, security, and legal teams to ensure that the solution can go live. What were the main things that you had to get them on board with? Because what I've noticed across a lot of clients is they don't really know what the good looks like and what is actually secure in non-deterministic world. So we have to get our stakeholders on board, and we have to educate them and take them on a journey with us. So what are your lessons learned on taking to production, and how did you get your security on board?
I think that every enterprise security organization is different. So you might ask the same question and you'll get completely different answers. And over sort of the past 2 years, with large language models becoming more popular, it really threw things off. A lot of teams were like, we're not going to do that at all. We're going to put these restrictions in. And as somebody who's working within the space, it's important to have very specific questions and understand where they're coming from. So if there's a concern about data, right, about customer data or internal data, what if we build something that already has public data? So if you have public documentation, what if we try our first conversational experience based on that? If there are still questions about data, the question isn't about data. It's about something completely different because you've met that criteria. And I think I was talking to a few folks upstairs and saying, when you're working in this space, you kind of have to become an expert in so many topics and legal and security because you need to be able to ask those questions in order to guide teams and go through that journey. Because otherwise, if they just say no and you don't know what to say next because you haven't thought about it, then the project ends, right?
Yeah, so for us, the security question is not just black and white. So first of all, not everything that Gen AI does in conversational AI is necessarily customer facing. There are fantastic applications that really make a difference in design time, right? There are cases like call summarization or shortening large customer inputs to shorter inputs. And the security risk is not so high, especially when you have a human in the loop. But we also see a lot of difference in the type of use case, right? For example, we work with a pharmaceutical company. They will never, ever create LLM-based customer-facing output, right? When it's about feedback on, let's say, vaccination side effects, it won't happen. But we have other clients from the travel industry who give inspiration about destinations. What can I do with my kids in August in Mallorca? That is maybe not as critical as pharmaceutical side effects. So it's a case-by-case decision to fine-tune on that spectrum of security.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of education and working with a customer to figure out, to Dennis, like what's the concern? Because previously, if they had an NLU bot, that data was still going somewhere. And so is it just that LLMs are scary, or is it that there's an actual concern and how can we work with you? And then, what's the use case that can work within the scope that you have?
Should we do one more? Yeah, we have to. Yeah, there was one right there.
It just hop out. I was curious, anybody using any of the LLM evaluation frameworks? You build a great bot, you probably leave a year from now. What objective metrics can your client use to understand the quality? And it isn't deteriorating, and all these LLM frameworks that are evaluation frameworks are emerging out there. Has anybody used them yet?
Yeah, so I think there are a few frameworks that came out, or metrics, whether it's faithfulness, Vegas, a couple of these different frameworks or metrics that have come out. I think what's important, going back to the KPIs, is being very specific in what you want to measure, because generally measuring good is not very, very helpful. So rather than measuring good or bad, we typically think about micrometrics. So come up with very specific questions that you want to categorize on a system, rather than something generic like, did you adhere to the knowledge there? So as an example, we found when we were deploying, our customers are deploying in production, 10 or so turns in, sometimes a large language model would revert its language back to English, even though it was prompted in a given language or responses were in a given language. So that's a very specific metric that we started tracking and retrying for and evaluating. And you can build up this whole category or library of micrometrics of starting off with one or two. And as you're in production for longer and longer, you get to understand specific issues that are being faced. Other things might be like, is your large language model using excessive punctuation, or is it using like markdown or other special characters that you might not want to use? And these specific metrics let you make specific improvements, because you give feedback to a product team and saying it's not good, they'll be like, great, now what?
Measuring the quality also isn't enough. Stating the obvious, there's also cost and latency and availability and all of that. But what we also figured is that many of our clients, they don't have the freedom of choice anyways, right? So after all, it's the legal requirements that force them into Azure, right? Or force them into their vendor of choice for the LLM, right? So it's not that they can choose from anything in the world. So benchmarking is actually in many cases limited to what the actual options are for our clients.
Whenever a new model is released, right, we get questions like, "Oh, can we use GPT 4.0? I heard it's faster." Like, well, you're using 3.5 now, so it's actually slower, right? So I think that you get that excitement, that hype cycle of a new model is released, people ask about it, and I think it's being able to fall back on, like, what is it that you want to accomplish? Are you already accomplishing that? I understand, like, it's fun to use a new model, it's fun to try new things. but I think it's about figuring out what model is best for your use case. And so sometimes when we do a classification, and if it's not working in GPT, we've moved over to Haiku, and you see the difference in the model and how so in this particular case, Haiku worked better, right? And so now when that customer comes to me and says, I want to try 4.0, sure, we can try it, but everything is working well with Haiku. So you want to try, you want to play with it, I get it. But I think that it's more about, are you meeting the requirements for that project? And then managing that expectation that new models are fun and cool to use.
Great.
Karen, I have a question to you before we end, right? I'm the proud owner of 7 Google Home devices. Can you do something for me that they feel a bit smarter?
That they what?
That they feel a bit smarter.
The big sigh. I wish they were smarter.
Okay, I see you working on it.
We'll just leave it at that. Let's talk next year. Okay, we'll come back next year and we'll regroup. It's it's a hard space to be in. But yes, I wish they could do everything we wanted them to do. Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you too.
Thank you.